Hello, everyone, and welcome to this conversation with Andy Russell, who is Dean and Professor in the College of Arts and Sciences at SUNY Polytechnic Institute in Utica, New York. This chat adds on to a discussion with Professor Lee Vinsel on maintenance and innovation. My name is Millen, and I'm with Gridium. Buildings use our software to run more efficiently. Today, Andy and I will explore the dark side of innovation, the history of Bell Labs, and a little bit of space exploration and Mars colonization, and what this tells us about maintenance.
Good. Okay, that's great.
To get started, I wanted to ask you about the dark side of innovation.
Yeah, the dark side of innovation. It's so it seems so mean to even bring it up in some ways
Hmm.
because there's such a positive vibe about innovation. It's so easy to get behind, and people just gravitate towards novelty and invention and inspiration
Hmm.
and creativity, and those are all aligned with the idea of innovation. And so to even say it has a dark side or to pursue that line of thought or to criticize innovators, I think is heretical to some people.
Hmm.
Even though we're not the first, Lee and I aren't the first people to say it. This idea has been around for a while. It's still, I think, a little bit jarring for some people to understand. So as we've been talking and making some of these arguments about innovation and about maintenance, I think we've become more careful over time not to say that innovation is bad or not to say that people shouldn't be creative or inventive or to get inspired about doing new things. That would be so hypocritical because Lee and I, you we love those things.
Right.
Um, it's more, this is where our distinction between innovation and innovation speak comes in,
Hmm.
that we feel like people who talk about innovation so much are overdoing it, and and that's regrettable for any number of reasons. One is it becomes its own cliche, and that's offensive mostly on stylistic grounds. It's just, but the same way any buzzwords just get annoying.
Right.
um, but but that's not really the core of the issue. The core of the issue is that it's a distraction, um, and it's a distraction from thinking realistically about technologies and thinking about how technologies work, thinking about how societies work. And one offshoot of that is that we give way more credit to innovators and inventors and inspirational figures, and no credit to the people who are really keeping things going. So that's the one of the big dark sides, for me, is what all this innovation talk hides and keeps us from thinking about.
And is it that the innovation talk distracts us, or do you think somehow modern society has developed an indifference to maintenance?
I think it's both. I think all the innovation talk feeds into this relative devaluing in modern societies for maintenance. I think it's always been a hard sell to get people to really pay attention to maintenance or care for maintenance or to respect people generally in lower classes, generally from disadvantaged backgrounds
Hmm.
who are maintainers. That's always been an uphill battle, but especially when we tell children and we have movies and all these things, the cultural incentives are to glorify invention, innovation. I think that only amplifies this problem that's been around for a long time in Western society.
Andy, I was reading your piece, the Nothing Special piece, and I was struck by how you framed this dynamic, which is that Americans would rather dream about smart cities than throw money into stupid potholes.
Yeah, that was a fun one to write.
And you see that time and again in your work and in your review of innovation and of maintenance.
Yeah, it's a political problem for sure. But elsewhere in that piece, I talk about ribbon cutting, and it's just more fun for everybody involved to celebrate a new building to put $50 million into a new building, to bury it in the ground, to fill the holes that we've made, or to fix the cracks that have appeared in the things that our parents made or someone else's grandfather made. That's just not as fun because you don't see it. There's a word that goes along with infrastructure that scholars use a lot, which is invisible. And it's true with standards too. They call it invisible. And sometimes I really don't like that shorthand, because I don't think these things are invisible. I don't think bridges are invisible.
No, indeed
I
not.
think it's a metaphor for what we choose to pay attention to and what we choose to ignore. So I think it's just more fun to celebrate new things and a new technological canvas like a smart city. Imagine the possibilities. It's amazing the different things that we could do, and it's just more fun to think about those possibilities instead of to face up to responsibilities that we have from previous generations and from things breaking.
So let's admit, for the sake of this discussion, that it is more fun to think about innovation. Does that suggest that there is a requisite value shift that modern society must undergo to rethink the words significant, to rethink what is old, and to place greater value on those existing technologies?
Yeah, I think that's right. Some of these ideas come from David Edgerton. He wrote a book called The Shock of the Old, and he really wanted to push us to rethink all of these things. What it means for something to be old, and like you said, what it means for something to be significant. And it is, like you say, I'm just repeating what you said, it is a cultural shift. How do we do that is kind of an interesting question. Some discussions in the maintainers group have revolved around how do we make maintenance cool, or how do we make it sexy.
Yep.
And that would certainly, those are strategies to get eyeballs and to get people interested, but there's something a little bit unsatisfying about those strategies as well, because it's the intrinsic value of these things that's why they're important. So that's why they're significant for their own sake. And cool and sexy makes me think that we need to bring markers of status from other things and paste them onto maintenance or infrastructure, that's not the whole puzzle. I think it really is something deeper, that people need to have a little bit more respect for not only that kind of work and the people that do it, but the reasons why it is significant. We just couldn't persist without it.
What role do you think standards play in the discussion around reframing cultural values for maintenance and for the intrinsic value of the structures that get maintained?
So I've spent a lot of my life in the last couple of decades now thinking about standards and where standards come from and why they're important. And one phrase that I come back to over and over again, it was a turn of phrase from Steve Usselman, a historian who's at Georgia Tech, who writes about railroads and computers, among other things. And it's to maintain, I guess, reliability under conditions of duress. So if things are just working fine, we don't need to really worry about systems breaking. That essence of working fine is because they're working, right? There's a circularity there. But what happens when there's special strains on a system, and what happens when there's unusual pressures on something? Like if the table in my office here, it just has some papers and books on it, that's fine. But what if you and I were jumping up and down on it? Or what if there was extra strain on it somehow? So that's the reason why we would want to know before we jumped on it, well, how much is this table supposed to hold? And what are these materials, if we nerded out about it, what are these materials rated for? How are these structures supposed to withstand those kinds of pressures? The people who build things, buildings or furniture, whatever it might be, really need to worry about that. So really makes it all possible. Standards really make it all possible because they embed all kinds of conversations about the strength of materials, tests that go into that, how we trust different people who will never meet, but if they create a certain building material or a certain structure, how do we know that their work is trustworthy? Well, we have standards.
Mm-hmm.
So, it really is support for basically everything, not just in materials, but if you think about even language or other modes of communication, standardized ways of speaking, ways of acting, greeting people, all these different standards and norms make everything else possible. So it's really the ground. Standards are really the ground out of which everything else can grow.
I know that you've done some thinking about the internet, and as you talked about a system under unplanned for or new levels of duress, I can't help but think about the recent influx of cybersecurity threats or the recent fragility of the internet and large swaths of the internet going down during DDoS attacks and the like. And what does that tell us about how we need to maintain the thing, which is the internet?
Yeah, great question. So I got into academia thinking that I wanted to write a history of the internet. And as I was doing that, the immediate question that I need to answer is, what is this thing called the internet? And I was most satisfied by an answer that featured standards at its core. So the internet is a network of networks that exchange data of all kinds using the TCP/IP standards, Transmission Control Protocol, Internet Protocol. That's a very basic version of it. But that's what all those networks have in common, and that's why we have one thing that we can refer to as an internet. And those standards and this internet came from a certain set of conditions. They were created in the 1970s by some researchers funded by the American Department of Defense, and they had specific goals in mind and designed a system with certain characteristics and did not think about other characteristics,
Right.
and had no way of knowing what was to come 20, 30 years down the line. That's right, as a technology in use. And so one reason why attacks and why cybersecurity itself is a field is that people have come up with ways to undermine or to shoot holes or exploit holes that those standards and other standards leave. So in connecting everything, then there's holes left open. So you're left with a cat and mouse game that actually recapitulates how standards work more generally. So there's a standards create a platform. The platforms can be used for certain things. Some of those uses are good and intended, and some are unintended and still good, and some are unintended and bad. And all those things are innovations, right, that sit on top of a platform. And so if some of those innovations are the quote-unquote dark side of innovation, like we were talking about before, then it's up to the system designers and maintainers to create a new set of standards to cope with that, and on and on and on. And so there's a tit for tat there, and we've seen tremendous sophistication, not only in antivirus software, in building those things into operating systems. I think users have gotten more sophisticated too in knowing whom to trust.
Yeah.
But the attackers have gotten more sophisticated too. So this thing is self-propelled in a way where there's a technical standard or a social standard or a norm, where it's behavior technology, and but then there's always novelties that push it, and on and on.
There are other and perhaps more concrete, to use the phrase, examples of the roles of standards can have in maintenance. And I think I'd like to hear you talk about the Bell Labs example and the two departments in its engineering team, the Department of Operations and Engineering, split from the Department of Development and Research. Can you share a little more about the role of standards and the split in the Bell Labs Innovation Factory along those two branches?
Yeah, so a little bit of history is in order. Before the internet and before digital computers, Americans had this thing called the Bell system, which was a monopoly telephone system created in the late 19th and consolidated in the early 20th century, blessed by regulators as a regulated monopoly
Hmm.
right around World War I. And it's a fascinating system. The history of the telephone system is a fascinating story. As it grew in the teens and 20s and continued to grow, and one system began to take shape, the management realized that they needed to differentiate between different types of engineering. There was at one point a unified engineering department, and then management realized that that didn't make sense. And so there was the split that you said. On the one hand, there were engineers who were really looking forward, who were doing development and research, and one Bell system president called this the engineering of the future.
Mm.
And then operations and engineering was a different set of engineers with a different set of skills who were doing what the president called the engineering of the present.
Mm.
And these two divisions were split in the early 1920s. And the engineering of the future in 1925 became called Bell Labs. It was split off as its own thing.
Ah, okay.
And for many, and it was just one unit of several units within the overarching Bell system. Now, many people today, of course, the Bell system was monopoly was destroyed in the early 1980s by antitrust regulators and broken up into baby bells, and then wireless came through, and now the whole thing's just a distant memory for most people. But if they remember it at all or think about it, they think about Bell Labs because there were a lot of really remarkable innovations that came out of Bell Labs. The transistor, satellite transmission, the Unix operating system,
Wow.
information theory, all sorts of Nobel Prizes went to people working in Bell Labs.
Wow.
But Americans who used telephones, like our grandparents and parents, and even me when I was little, really didn't touch Bell Labs. What we touched were phones in service provided by local operating companies, or long distance, a term that is no longer in use in contemporary discourse. But
Hmm.
if I wanted to call grandma, we'd call her long distance. And
Would she accept the charges?
yeah, exactly. Or we see it on the bill, right?
Yeah.
It's a big charge on the bill. And that was those were different units of people. So in an essay that I wrote, I wanted to look back and think about different types of labor who maintain the telephone system, and the numbers that I could find from the 40s and 60s, and I did a pretty quick look at it. One could dig deeper. Is that only about 1 to 2%, 1.5% of the total employees of the entire Bell system were working in Bell Labs. We're doing the sexy stuff. We're doing the Nobel Prize winning stuff. About 1%, call it. The other 98, 99% were either in the manufacturing branch of the Bell system, a company called Western Electric, hundreds of thousands of people,
Hmm.
or upwards 500,000 people or more working for these local operating companies, providing high quality, reliable service for Americans at regulated rates. So, so the Bell system is a good example of how the guys in the labs get all the credit. You know, they're remembered as the heroes, but they're the 1%. The system's value, the significance for those of us who needed to talk to our
Grandma.
parents
Hmm.
or grandma or call for an ambulance or a doctor's appointment. We knew that that phone would work when we picked it up because of the Bell system's excellent practices of maintenance and reliability, and this program of standardization that was so comprehensive. I think nobody listening to this would even believe the things that they standardized.
I was
So
surprised too when I heard a little bit about it, and I'd love to hear you describe it more. I think I think it was called the Bell System Practices Index of Standards.
yeah, so the index. So all the Bell System standards, or what later became called the Bell System Practices or BSPs,
Ah,
um, the index itself was about 1,000 pages.
wow.
Those aren't the standards. That's just the index. The standards themselves covered um, every aspect you can think of. I mean, think about a telephone system, just a technological system with
Hmm.
the handsets and the lines and the central offices and the buildings, and the layout of those buildings was standardized. The uniforms of all these people and the logos were standardized. But but
Wow.
also as the Bell system and the telephone system as a complex socio-technical system, this logic of standardization permeated everything. So they had standardized cutlery is one example. Standardized models
Really?
for, yeah, silverware for sure. Um, First aid kits. So
Can I ask an obvious question?
sure.
What does cutlery have to do with making sure that the phone works when you pick up the handset?
Well, uh, if you look at telephone service as just the handset, then nothing at all. But if you recognize that it takes it takes a village, as they say, or it takes an entire bureaucratic and regulatory and cultural apparatus to make that handset possible and affordable.
Yeah,
Then you get a little bit closer because then you understand that there's thousands of people whose job it is to make sure that everything is the same. It's kind of like a military logic of standardization at that point. So cutlery is one aspect of that. There are many others.
I guess, Andy, it shouldn't be, since that's true, it's no surprise that innovation is sexier than maintenance.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. Why? If you were to ask anybody if they wanted to spend a day with someone inventing new things in a lab or someone who's imprinting spoons with a Bell logo, uh, I mean, I think it'd be interesting to hang out with the people doing the spoons. But
Right.
if you were to make a movie about it, or try and make it appealing, or try and get young people to enter one of those fields, I think they'd want to go into the lab. Although, to be fair, I think they have a vision of what the lab is like that is probably different than how labs actually work. Labs are pretty boring, mundane places in their own right,
Hmm.
but but our society holds them out as crucibles of greatness and novelty. So that's a different subject,
Sure.
uh,
I mean, the
but
Bunsen
yeah,
burners are in the labs.
exactly, yeah. Well, and you can do things differently instead of doing the same thing over and over and over and over and
Yeah.
over again.
So we're actually back to where we started a little bit around the concept of innovation being sexier and attractive and the shiny object and maintenance. Well, maintenance not. Your work shows that this has wide-ranging implications for modern civil society. And I think you and Lee explored this a little bit when it came to the potential colonization of Mars.
Yeah, so this was, kind of like our first essay, Hell the Maintainers. This was an essay that we wrote also for Aeon that came out of a combination of frustration and just, some sense of that things are just a little absurd. So, so we wrote an essay for Aeon called Whitey on Mars, and it's about Elon Musk and his fantasy of colonizing Mars.
Hmm.
And it just neither Lee and I, we don't have strong feelings about the space program one way or another, or the exploration of outer space. It's not really something. I mean, I watched space shuttles take off, and it was cool, but
Right.
it's not something I spend a lot of time thinking about. But it increasingly, as we've seen talk of colonizing Mars get more and more hype, it just there's such a disconnect with what we see as pressing problems and important problems, and it just seems like a leap into the world of fantasy. And so I think Lee had this idea. He was just reading about Elon Musk and these plans, and he said, we've got to write an essay called Whitey on Mars, and I burst out laughing because the notion is so absurd. But and we had talked about the Gil Scott-Heron song Whitey on the Moon before, but
Right.
immediately when he said it, I said, you're right. You know, this is just crazy that people are so caught up in this, and I think they probably don't realize how silly it all seems. They need to take a step back and understand some of the bigger picture. That was our feeling.
To paraphrase Lucian Walkowitz from the Adler Planetarium in Chicago, I want to ask you, Andy, why do you think we'd rather innovate a habitat on Mars over maintaining a habitable climate on Earth?
You know, it's tough for me to identify with that because I don't. I think it's crazy. But why does this appeal to so many people? I think there's a lot of appeal in doing something and accomplishing something that's never been accomplished before. There is something, there's a gravity in the stars, and there is something sensational about looking up on a cold, clear night and seeing all these stars and wondering about our place in the universe.
Indeed.
And boy, does, you know, Elon Musk is an inspirational guy for a number of reasons, but space exploration is really seductive. And to think that we can actually do it, I mean, to think that we can go for spacewalks is amazing.
It is.
So it's in some sense, it sounds crazy, but it's an easy problem. I think it's an easier problem than addressing poverty or trying to overcome racism or name any number of public health problems.
Sure.
Gun violence, you name it. Let alone some of the challenges of environmental sustainability, and trying to wean ourselves from fossil fuels and trying to get that cultural and economic influence out of our lives that we need to. We're in an oil and coal mentality. So I said it sounds crazy to think we could explore outer space or colonize Mars, but there's no precedent there. There's no infrastructure, and it's to go the first time and do it the first time. The only problems that Elon Musk and his crew are thinking about now are technical problems. You know, how do they make a rocket booster go faster,
right.
Fuel be reusable, and so, you know, you can seclude yourself and think about those problems and hide away. And I think that's easy. I think it's the easy way out.
So there's no precedence either for the answer, and I don't expect you to have it, but I'm inclined to ask you anyway, Andy, what would it take for maintenance to inspire people in the same way as, say, a Falcon 9 rocket from SpaceX?
Boy. Well, yeah, I don't have a good answer for that. You know, people get talking about infrastructure and maintenance when they see connections to their own lives. And it's a fundamentally different phenomenon than people getting excited watching a rocket take off, because that's, I think, literally an escape from our world and our lives. But we see political forces mobilize around infrastructure when things go badly wrong, and when we realize that we can fix it. So pick your disaster. You know, a train crash, the Flint water scene, the Oroville Dam in California that now they think might not breach. But there are these moments of either disaster or being on the verge of disaster when we do see people coming together and thinking more about how do we make it better. But you know, will it ever have the same appeal as as a rocket?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it strikes a different chord in people. So So my approach is to try and get people to cultivate that space in themselves that would react positively to opportunities to fix things and to make lives better for people who depend on all these things.
Yeah. Well, and that's what you're doing with the Maintainers Organization and at maintainers.org. And I wish you and Lee the best of luck in that effort.
Thanks, Millen. It was a lot of fun talking to you. And yeah, people should visit the website and read the papers. It's been so much fun to see different people come together and offer up different ideas on topics that we never knew anything about. So and it's fun. It's a really fun community, and it's a good cause too.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and for further reading, check out Andy Russell's piece, Nothing Special, and the Aeon article co-authored with Lee about the mission to Mars. This and more information is available on themaintainers.org, and of course, we explore these concepts on the Gridium blog. If you have questions, please email Andy at arussell@arussell.org or us at info@gridium.com. Okay, and with that, I'd like to thank Andy for joining us today.
Okay, thanks.